Mercantilism is an economic theory where there is a fixed amount of wealth in the world and that a nation's prosperity is dependent on its success in bringing wealth by exporting more than its imports, which in other words means earning profits from its exports. This system was around in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and Europe mainly used mercantilism in the government, where they had strictly controlled trade. Also, colonial markets were kept strong and governments usually banned colonies from importing goods from other European colonies. As a result, this eliminated competitions and meant that the people in the colonies could only buy goods made in the home country. Next, mercantilism held many connecting principles. Valuable metals such as gold and silver were considered to be vital to a nation's wealth. And if a nation did not possess mines or have access to them, those precious metals should be attained through trade. Not to mention, it was believed that trade balances must be favorable, which means an excess amount of exports over imports. On the other hand, colonial possessions should open up the markets for exports and as vendors of raw materials to the mother country. In fact, manufacturing in the colonies was prohibited, and every trade between colonies and the mother countries was held to be a monopoly of the mother country.
After Americanism continued for almost 2 centuries, some people started resisting it. The most notable ones were the American colonists who rebelled in 1776. This was later known as the American Revolution, which laid the groundwork for the creation of the United States of America. You might wonder why the Americans rebelled after being under mercantilism for so long. The first reason for that was the Navigational Act, which was passed in 1651, which stated that the colonial exports was first to pass through British control and then be distributed towards the rest of Europe. Because of corruption, however, this law was easily avoided by many merchants. This led to the English products being cheaper than the French. This hurt the British West Indies market in sugar, molasses, and rum. The straw that broke the camel's back, however, was when Britain decided to increase its taxation on its colonies. The reason for that being was the fact that they were left weak and eager for money after an expensive war with France, and since Britain's colonies were taxed less than the citizens that lived inside of Britain, they decided to tax their colonies more. The American Revolution started in 1776 and it kicked off with armed conflict. In 1778, the French joined the colonist side, and with their assistance, the colonist army forced the British forces to surrender in Yorktown, Viagra, in 1781. 2 years later, the revolution ended and the Americans won. After the American Revolution succeeded, it caused a screeching halt towards the British mercantilism, since a huge portion of Britain's trade came from America. Another major reason for the end of British mercantilism was the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th century.
Adam Smith is the famous author of the two best well-known books called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, and The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. He was a Scottish social philosopher that pioneered the political economy and was a key figure of the Scottish Revolution. Smith was born on sometime in June 1723 in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, following up with the death of his father 6 months later. Smith died of July 17, 1790 in Edinburgh and was unmarried. Smith attended the Burgh School and entered the University of Glasgow at the age of 14. He eventually transferred to the Balliol College of Oxford and later graduated with considerable amount of knowledge about European literature. After graduating, Smith returned home and started giving a series of lectures at the University of Edinburgh about ethics, rhetoric, jurisprudence, and of course political economy. During his time as a lecturer, he met his lifelong friend David Hume in 1750. Hume got Smith a job back at the University of Glasgow as a professor of logic, then as chair of moral philosophy a year later. Smith later resigned from his professorship and obtained a profitable job as the tutor of the young Duke of Buccleuch. Smith and his people traveled through Switzerland and France, but mostly through France, and came to know other fellow professors such as Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Francis Quesnay, and Robert Turgot. After he finished his tutors with the Duke, he retired and traveled back to his home in 1776 and later wrote the book An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which was published the same year as America has declared their independence. Adams stated in his book that a country's wealth isn't based on the accumulated gold it gets, but the production of goods and land. He discouraged tariffs, which was to achieve the most favorable trade by taking in valuable metals into the country by exporting goods. He viewed that self-interest creates prosperity, and that letting people pursue their self-interest will create even greater prosperity within strict government regulations. He also stated the free market as some sort of invisible hand, which is a metaphor for how individuals operate through a system of interdependence in a free market. It basically means that when people purchase something, they do it for their own profit of gaining something physical, and the seller of the object gains money in return as well, making it a win-win scenario. The invisible hand principle states that all methods of production and distribution shall be privately owned. If the trade is not interfered by any kind of government regulations, then society will develop rapidly by itself. Smith also addressed the three elements of prosperity: self-interest, limited government, and solid currency and free market economy.
Now, the father of capitalism, who was a Scottish philosopher named Adam Smith, opposed the idea of mercantilism. He argued that if everyone earns the freedom to produce and exchange goods as they please and open up the markets to domestic and foreign competition, people's self-interest would contribute to a greater prosperity than with the regulations made by the government. He also believed that the humans would ultimately promote public interest through their everyday economic choices. Eventually, once mercantilism declined, as it was explained earlier due to the American Revolution of 1776, Adam Smith introduced the world to capitalism, which is also commonly known as the free enterprise or the free market. Capitalism is basically an economic and political system where a country's trade and industry are managed by private owners for profit, unlike mercantilism, where the governments are the only ones who are allowed to control trade, as mentioned earlier. In other words, the government does not have any interventions. Only privatized companies have a role and are responsible for these. Under capitalism, prices and wages are dependent on the forces of supply and demand. The goal of members of a capitalist economy is to obtain the maximum amount of utility, in other words, benefit or profit, at the least cost. Furthermore, private industries provide the consumers that want goods and services at the greatest value, but at the same time, the industries try to keep it at the lowest price. And so competition forces companies to keep their prices low in order to attract more consumers. In a sense, the role of the government in a capitalist society is to protect the legal rights, not to control the free market system.